All right, good to see you all. I will see you this week in class on Thursday, but I wanted to weigh in a little bit on the discussion posts and give you some, food for thought on some of the topics we're going to be covering in the upcoming weeks. So I wrote a few thoughts down, and there were some really good points that you guys have been making about good research questions, bad research questions. The concept of relevance came up quite a bit. The idea of a good research question being something that is honestly relevant to clinical practice, to what patients need. Some of what we'll talk about this week and in this upcoming module is the idea of relevance socially, culturally, and how much of our research agenda, very broadly speaking, which therefore is a reflection upon the research questions that get asked and the questions that get developed. But how much of that agenda is socially and culturally relevant, specifically in our medical culture as well. So that's kind of one of the seeds that is planted already from your discussion posts, but I wanted to highlight because it's an interesting part of where we'll step off in terms of critique, not just in terms of the logistics and the technical aspects of studies, but also the larger context in which the studies are being done. Another point that came up in the discussion post that I thought was really interesting was the concept of innovation. There's sort of two competing interests that came up in a lot of the posts, that the idea that some research questions are good or are seen as good because they're addressing something in an innovative way, or they're looking at really innovative ideas or new ways to do things, looking at technologic advances, and how many of those questions and methods of inquiry and paths of inquiry are seen as potentially more valuable in our social and cultural context because they prioritize innovation. We see this in academia, we see this in science, we see this in, social media. So, in all realms, there's definitely a lot of prize money, so to speak, a lot of social capital when we value innovation. And sometimes our drive for innovation, technologic advances, drives the research questions that are asked and the research questions that are deemed feasible. So those are things to think about. In contrast to innovation, I think about the concept of feasibility, that sometimes we're looking for really new and inventive stuff to ask questions about and to investigate. And sometimes what we're looking at is, can the study be done? And sometimes that's what determines a good or bad question, and therefore a good or bad study. So we'll look at some of those things too, and really just starting to critique and look at studies from the concept of innovation, feasibility, relevance, and then a few other things, money. Anytime we're talking about research, we're talking about academics, we're talking about medicine, honestly, our healthcare system as it's currently set up and delivered, our healthcare as it's currently delivered, we have to follow the dollars. So that's also partly what determines whether or not certain questions get asked, right? And whether certain paths of inquiry get to be followed. And then to kind of overlap that, the concept of political capital, social capital in many arenas, and what sorts of things grab people's attention, what sorts of things help people vie for power. So sometimes the questions we want to ask, and I'll be honest, this comes up for me when I write articles or present at conferences. Sometimes the stuff that I want to talk about isn't the stuff that people want. I don't want to say don't want to hear, but doesn't have the same grab, right? Isn't the stuff that draws people in for a conference, isn't the thing that generates money, isn't the thing that maybe could actually just impact people on an individual level, and doesn't have quite as much capital in terms of larger financial and or systemic impact. So when we think about good or bad research questions, partly why I wanted you guys to look into that idea and have a discussion about it is, honestly, the same things that determine whether or not questions are good or bad, and that we weigh when we decide whether or not a question is good or bad. There's some technical stuff, like did you ask the question in a way that can be understood? Was it specific enough, or was it too broad? Was it so specific that, honestly, the possibility of finding any information on a particular topic, or creating any information on that topic is going to be very, very challenging. There's some real technical aspects of asking a great question, and that was some of the information that I posted online and that you had an opportunity to look at, and a lot of you considered in your post. And the same is also going to be true for studies. There's the technical aspect, but then there's also this larger context that I always want us to hold, and the same context is true for creating questions, and we're going to hold when we look at, how do you read and critique and appraise studies. Some of it is going to be the technical stuff, the feasibility, the innovation, the application, and then the other piece is going to be capital, interest, grab, social media influence, all of that kind of stuff. And we'll talk a lot about then how to get good information if then, in addition to the technologic aspect of science, we are also simultaneously weighing the social and cultural medical aspects of science. So all of you gave this a lot of thought in your posts. You had some great discussions. I really love to see the actual conversation happening in an online form. It's it's always challenging to do that, so I appreciate the fact that you guys took the time to make it happen. We will have many more conversations on this, but I wanted to, show my face because I haven't done that yet. I feel like Chris Wade's videos explained some of the technical stuff a little bit better, so it felt better to just use the material he had and was willing to share. You'll certainly see my face again on Thursday, and just to give you a little bit more, I'll give you another idea of what we're also considering in this class in addition to the technical stuff. So I think those are all my observations. I'll leave you with some questions, as I always like to, is just sort of leave you with food for thought. So a couple of questions I wrote down. We think about types of studies, and we start to think about critiquing and appraising studies. Start to think about what types of studies are done. So not only what questions are asked, but what topics do we prioritize in our social, cultural, medical contexts. And then what types within those do we prioritize in terms of thinking of them as good information versus bad information. So we'll kind of expand that question of good question, bad question to good information, bad information. What can certain studies be done? How are certain studies done because they are done more efficiently than others? So kind of addressing that feasibility issue. Are certain studies better or worse because they translate to patient care better? So sometimes our studies that are executed more efficiently don't necessarily translate to patient care as well, because there are certain elements of patient care, as we all know, that are highly inefficient, and probably rightly so, because we are not machines, we are humans. The other question I leave you with is how can we appraise and critique studies when ultimately the models that we are creating studies within are of our own creation? So to some extent, we are assuming the models are intact, the models are good, and then we create studies within those models. And sometimes when we are appraising studies, what is incorrect potentially is the model or the framework within which we are creating the study. So I kind of want to always give that consideration to the larger context. So those are things I'm leaving you with. Those are things I want you to think about. You are already thinking about it in the context of the research question. And I want us to keep thinking about that this week and moving into our discussion. Since Thursday's class will kind of be action-packed with our literature search workshop and having our time with Julie from the library, I just want to make sure that I had an opportunity to ask you some of these questions and stir up some of those thoughts before we get together. All right, I will see you on Thursday. I look forward to finally meeting all of you in person. Take care. Bye.